In the almost 20 years since launching Buddhist Geeks, one of the most powerful and profound things that's come out of this exploration of Buddhism meeting the contemporary world is the practice of relational or social, or what I call multiplayer meditation. With my longtime collaborator and friend Chris Ewald, we've been building a new company called Interbeing Inc., whose purpose is to make meditation multiplayer. We're working on building a platform and a game called Interbe.ing, which introduces people to the practice of multiplayer meditation, which offers them support in learning how to share and facilitate these practices, and ultimately in being able to develop and innovate on the core methodology. If you'd like to check out multiplayer meditation, join a free session with us, see what it's like, see what we're building, I'd love if you come join us at interbe.ing. So thank you for coming back for another Our Beloved Teacher episode. We had a great conversation. I think it was like 20 months ago that we recorded the first episode of this,
I
actually.
don't even hear how long ago that was.
Yeah, it took a while to go from our first recording, which, by the way, thank you for being the first guest in the series and for believing in it and helping make it happen. But it took 20 months from the time we recorded that to actually launching the series. And so it's now live, which is beautiful with your first beloved teacher, Cincinnati.
Yeah, and I think it's such a worthy project that you're engaged in and that you're devoting a lot of your creative time and energy to bring to life. And I just want to offer a bow to you because I think it's a gift to all future generations. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. So we're here today to talk about your next beloved teacher in the series, Kōbun Chino Roshi. I wanted to, I guess, start by just sharing the story of how I first learned about Kōbun Chino, and then would love to, of course, hear all the stories that you have from spending so many years practicing with him. Yeah, in my early 20s, Emily and I, we moved out to Colorado from North Carolina, where we were living at the time. And I went to Naropa University to try to finish my undergraduate degree. And when we first arrived there, I remember like going into I think it was like the student lounge or whatever.
Yeah.
And I saw on one of the walls a picture of this Japanese Zen teacher, and there's a little kind of story underneath it. So I'm like, okay, what's this about? And it was about Kōbun Chino, and it talked about his life, his teaching, and it talked about how he was a visiting professor at Naropa, or he'd been present there, living there, and then this sort of tragic accident with, I forget it was maybe a niece or a granddaughter. I can't remember the person, but I remember the story of him trying to save someone close to him who was drowning and unfortunately got caught in that himself and passed.
Yeah, it
So
was his little girl, his daughter.
it was his daughter.
Yeah, who was, I think, 5 years old at that time.
Oh my gosh. So not, I wasn't a parent at the time. Now that really hits me even harder now, but
Yeah, yeah,
it
I
hit
really
hard. It
understand.
was like,
Yes.
what a life and and death, really, was thinking. But beyond that, I don't really, and haven't really known much about him. So I'm actually quite excited to hear what your experience was like training with Kōbun Chino, how you met him, just anything you want to share around the story. I would love to hear.
Yeah, met Kōbun by accident, quote unquote accident, the way these things happen when we're practicing the Dharma with some measure of sincerity and giving a lot of time and energy to it. And I was actually had brought my daughter. We went on a road trip across the country, and we were looking for a Zen community where we could live, actually, to live and practice. But in those days, this was 1976, the few Zen centers that actually had families, the amount of time that the parents got to spend with the children was so minimal that I really didn't wound up not wanting to do that. But in the course of this journey, I met some friends who said, hey, we're going to Sesshin, which is a Zen meditation retreat, silent retreat. We're going to a Sesshin with our teacher, Kōbun. Do you want to come? And I happened to have childcare and vacation from work. It just worked out. And I went with them. And I actually have written about this. When I walked into the Zendo, I couldn't tell who was the teacher. There was no raised platform. There was no throne. There was just this guy in Japanese work clothes sitting in the corner, this small bearded man. And I didn't really, until that evening when he began to speak. And it was clear that was their teacher. He was just, did not want to raise himself above anybody else. That's just how he sat in the row with everybody at that time. And he began to speak, and his words spoke directly to me. You know, when you have that feeling that a teacher is speaking directly to you. Later, he told me, that's how you know that's your teacher when that happens. And so at that session, I actually was in a lot of conflict because I was studying with Sansanim. I had taken precepts with him. I had become a Dharma teacher in that community. And here I was captivated by this whole other way of teaching the Dharma. And I went in, you get one private meeting face to face with the teacher called Dokusan during the course of the retreat. And when I remember I was working in the garden when when my turn was called to have that meeting a few days into the retreat. I was really nervous about meeting the teacher. I can just feel it even right now. And I remember wiping my hands on my jeans and walking over to the yurt where he was in this little yurt. You had to duck down to get in and then offer a bow and then sit down cross-legged face to face. And I just began pouring out my conflict, and I sit with it. And then he listened, and it was tilted his head in a certain way of listening. And then he asked me, when all the teachers are gone, dead and gone, who will be your teacher? And I was very confident that I knew the answer. And I said, everything will be my teacher. And he said, no, you yourself will be your teacher. And I just thought, oh no, he sees right through me. He sees all my looking outside of myself for validation, for information, for insight, for illumination. He sees all that. And he's just pointing me directly back into my own heart to trust my own intuitive wisdom. And that actually became a kind of koan. Koan is like a Zen question that isn't meant to have a linear logical answer. It's a question that you just drop into your heart and explore. And then the answer can be very idiosyncratic and personal and spontaneous. It's your answer. So that really became a koan for me for the next decades, actually. And I would say in some ways it still is. I was not a very confident person. And so it was hard to believe when he said that, but I knew what he meant. And after that retreat, I went to meet with him near his zendo, and he had a zendo in Los Altos. And I'll just to say a teeny bit of the history that Suzuki Roshi, who is the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center complex of Green Gulch Farm and Tassajara Mountain Monastery and the city center and maybe other places I'm forgetting. But Suzuki Roshi, when he founded the San Francisco Zen Center with some Westerners, he really needed help to be able to found the monastery. And he invited Kōbun to come from Japan. And Kōbun had gone through all the studies. You can read his bio online. He had a very illustrious education and was the jewel of the Soto school of Zen in Japan. And his teacher, Chino Roshi, had taken him under his wing when he was a boy and trained him. And when Kōbun asked for his permission to come to America, he said no. And that happened 3 times. And in the Buddhist tradition is if you ask 3 times and the answer is no each time, that's it. When the Buddha was asked, and I mention this just because today happens to be International Women's Day, whatever it will be when you all are listening to it. But when Mahapajapati, the Buddha's foster mother, with a group of women, asked the Buddha if they could join the community, he said no. And he said no twice before his cousin and attendant Ananda persuaded him, told him why this would be a good idea to say yes. And the third time he said yes. But Chino Roshi said no 3 times to Kōbun, and he wound up coming anyway. Later, his Chino Roshi found another heir, another successor, and that's when Kōbun took the name of his family of priests, Otogawa, and how his name became Kōbun Chino Otogawa. But after the
Oh,
retreat,
okay.
I went to Los Altos, where people had created a small zendo in a garage, a reconverted garage for Kōbun and his students on the peninsula there. And the place that he gave me to meet with him turned out to be a park. And when I made my way to where he was sitting on the edge of a sandbox, watching his 2 little kids play in the sand. And I sat down on the edge of the sandbox and I said to him, "Hey, I'm really surprised that you're a Zen priest babysitting. I just haven't seen that before." I had been more exposed to monastic teachers, my Asian teachers. And he said, "Yes, it's Tuesday, and that's my day to help around the house and babysit for the kids." And honestly, Vince, I thought I must have died and gone to heaven, woke up in a place. Remember, this was 1976, and a lot of our Asian teachers were monastic. And so this was a real eye opener for me and an invitation to practice in the way that Kōbun really recommended, which is in the context of your life, your traditions, your family, your marriage. You really make the practice your own in that way. And that it was really important. And I didn't need to repudiate my first teacher, my Korean teacher, De Sansanim, or anything like that. I did wind up surrendering my Dharma teacher robes a few years later. But looking back with I often refer to the 2020 vision of the retrospectoscope, right? Hindsight. I didn't even need to do that. There was no conflict at all. That was just my lack of understanding at the beginning. So Kōbun he was an eccentric person. He did things his own way, which is the biggest example would be his leaving his master, which is what he called him, his teacher in Japan, and coming to America, and then encountering all these hippies and really embracing people. He has such deep compassion that I think he was always intuitively drawn to people who were suffering the most and would just develop them in his beautiful wisdom and compassion. And I can tell you a story about that too from my life with my brother, who was diagnosed with a severe mental illness and had a lot of struggles and suffering in his life. And at this time, he was in a halfway house. He had left the hospital and was getting ready to move out and live on his own. And so he was in a halfway house. And Kōbun came to Cambridge, where I lived at the time. He came, I think, to visit and do some fundraising. And he asked to visit my brother because he knew what a big part of my life my brother was. And so we went over there. We drove over to the halfway house and up the wooden stairs. It was a triple decker. And we went up to my brother's room. It was a comfy but shabby house. And my brother's room, there was an ashtray on the dresser overflowing with cigarette butts and chewed bubble gum and stuff. And I felt this mix. I wrote about this too. I felt this mix of both admiration for my brother for not having felt like he had to clean up, or pretend that he was like a neat and tidy person when he wasn't, but also a little regret that he hadn't cleaned up.
Makes sense.
And my brother, he was just like wreathed in smiles. He bowed to Kōbun. "This is such a great honor that you would come and visit me, Kōbun." And that was just very sweet. And we sat down on the bed and they talked. And then Kōbun stood up and he had this big, long sleeve in his priest's robe, a sleeve that I guess it would function like a man bag. You could carry your stuff in it. And he reached into his sleeve and he pulled out an inkstone and calligraphy brush. And Jonathan went and got some water, my brother, and then he put the water in the inkstone and he rubbed it and he got the ink. And then he actually had some rice paper also in that sleeve and he pulled it. He made this, and calligraphy was one of the arts. He was a painter also, one of the Zen arts that he was great at and taught. And he made a beautiful calligraphy just right there on my brother's little wooden desk. And then he handed it to my brother and he translated, "Life blooms in the midst of suffering." And my brother was very moved, and I was very moved too, because it was such a beautiful reminder of what our life is. So much of the time, what our life is. And sometimes the suffering is just niggling. I would call it a little bit neurotic suffering. Oh my gosh, I'm late for my time with Vince because I misread the calendar, that kind of suffering. And sometimes it's huge. It's the loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's just earth shattering kind of heartbreak. So everything in between, and our life can blossom. And that respecting that blossoming and pointing to the beauty of that was a great gift from Kōbun. Let's see, another story I can tell you. I have so many stories of Kōbun. Oh, and Kōbun he did teach everybody how to have a monastery at Tassajara. He really did found that monastery. And as I said, you can read his life history in jikoji.org. And Jikoji is the temple that he founded in Northern California. And that too was a really interesting story because the community acquired this land, and it turned out that there was a community of very committed hippies who were living on that land. And so I think some of the Zen students were really hoping that they would leave and they could have their nice pristine Zen scene on the land. But Kōbun said no. He wanted everybody to be part of it. And there were people that other people thought were really pretty nuts, but everybody was included. And it was so inconvenient, and people really had a hard time with it because it wasn't easy to integrate these two communities at all. But I always felt like this was Kōbun's version of sort of intense Dharma training, of creating situations where you were just required to stretch in terms of your capacity for patience, for compassion, for all these spiritual strengths and goodnesses. And yes, and so you can go on jikoji.org and learn lots of the biographical information about Kōbun. And I'll just tell you another story from my own experience. Unless there's something you'd like to say, Vince, and I've just been talking and talking, let's make some room for you here.
No, that's the point here. At some point, maybe I'll share. Emily and I had a pretty wild experience at Jikoji where we felt like we met Kōbun in a way, although he'd been dead for a
Okay,
while.
tell it now. Tell it now.
Okay,
I
sure.
want to hear it, and then I'll continue.
It's one of those kind of mystical stories where you have to be there to really appreciate it. But I went to Jikoji to lead like a workshop, and we knew the connection. Like we knew this was a monastery that Kōbun Chino had founded. We knew about his connection to you. So we were like excited to go up there, and we came there and we were just checking out the land, and we walked up to the trail where the trails were, and the kind of ridge trails, and we
Yes,
were
yes.
up on the ridge walking, and then we had this moment of just looking around and noticing it was a full moon was out and the full sun, and they were equidistant to each other. If we stretched out our arms in either direction, we'd have the full moon on one side and the full sun on the other, and they're same size, of course. And we're just sitting up here, whoa, thank you. This is an amazing
Yeah.
introduction. And it had that air when something like that happens where it had a mystical importance, significance. And I felt like I met the spirit of Kōbun Chino in a way. Like it was like being invited to this vision or this view of
Oh, that's
life.
beautiful. Yeah, no, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, let me find another story for you.
It really is beautiful up there.
The other thing about Kōbun, as I said before, he was an artist. And so I think for you to have that splendid vision of beauty in nature, that's the kind of gift that Kōbun would give you. Do you know what I'm saying? He really, there was a kind of elegance and beauty around him and the things that he created that I really loved, actually. I really loved. Let's see. Kōbun made it possible for me to go visit all of the Zen centers, City Center in San Francisco, Green Gulch, and Tassajara. And he knew I was on this quest to look for a community for my daughter and me. And I got to sit a sesshin at the City Center while Hillary, my daughter, was with my parents. I got to sit a guest student at Tassajara and just to visit and stay over at Green Gulch. I didn't stay there for more than a day or two before I realized it was not the right place either. But afterwards, I told him of my impressions of all these places. And he was so, just again, so appreciative and so curious and such a great listener. And I told him about dropping my round chopstick during the strictly silent sesshin at City Center and how it just rolled thunderously past the whole row of meditators. Of course, it would be a round chopstick, right? It wouldn't stop. It had to roll all the way down to the end before I uncrossed my legs, which were half asleep, staggered to my feet, retrieved it. Meanwhile, everyone's watching and pretending not to. And yeah, he was so spacious, so much space that these things could happen around him and there would just be no shame. No shame, no blame, nothing like that. And oh, so another good story that I told about him in this memoir that I am writing is my brother wound up moving out to New Mexico to live on the mountain near the little zendo that Kōbun founded above Taos, above on El Salto, on that mountain. And I can't remember, maybe 1983. That one actually, I think, was started after Jikoji. But again, you can find all those details. But so he would have sashins and he invited my brother to come out and live there, which my brother did.
Wow.
And that's a whole story in and of itself, but I want to focus on Kōbun here. And Kōbun, he was just very relaxed about a lot of things. And people were smoking pot in the evenings. And I felt like I'm the big sister, right? Protective of my brother. I felt like that might be destabilizing for my brother. And I I talked to Kōbun, we went for a walk, and I was just like pouring out why I didn't think he should be doing this. And he just looked at me and said, "Do you think I should be setting an example?" Of course, I thought he should be setting an example for everybody. But he would always go to the heart of some assumption and make you question it, really question it. Is that the role of the teacher? Is that what he was supposed to be doing? Be an example that we could all follow? That was not his teaching. He used to talk about he wanted his sangha to be like gorillas, sneaking and spreading the dharma invisibly and unobtrusively. And yeah, he had a very, very different vision. And during one of those stays where I was visiting my brother and sitting with Kōbun, there were a bunch of people who came to the house where he was staying, Arroyo Seco, and he would always be welcoming, always hospitable. And so a group of us were there, and we were all making lunch together with Kōbun, miso soup and tofu and big rice cooker full of brown rice. And we got everything ready and we set the table. It was a long wooden table with, I don't know how many people were there, but quite a few, probably about 12, maybe even 15. And Kōbun sat and said, "Please go ahead and eat." And he just left For a moment, it seemed we didn't know. Maybe he needed a bio break or whatever. He just left for a moment. He went into his room and we started eating, bring our miso soup. And then we realized a long time had gone by and Kōbun hadn't come back, like maybe a half hour. And I thought, okay, I'm the visitor. I don't get to see him that often. I'm going to knock on the door. No answer. And I knock again. No answer. So I just opened the door and peeked in. And Vince, the room was empty. We saw him go into that room. And I thought, wait a minute. He doesn't have that many special powers, does he? And then I realized the window. It was a high window. It wasn't just a regular window. It was up high and it was open. And I was like, oh my gosh, he climbed out the window. He escaped. Yeah. So that's what I mean. He just really, but on the other hand, I remember visiting his home. I think it was the first time. No, I came back. I brought Hillary. And it was her 10th birthday. And we were having dinner at his house. And halfway through the dinner, the phone rang. And it was one of his students who had run out of gas. I don't even remember where. I don't think it was too far away. But anyway, Kōbun got up, put on his wool cap and his heavy outer robe and got in the car to go get gas and take it to this student. And I tell this story because, first of all, it was baffling to me as disappointing as the guest. I saw his wife was rolling her eyes, and but I realized that's it. He will give everything to his students. He was on call like that 24/7. And of course, that's not really a sustainable pattern. And he did go into a kind of retirement/retreat that lasted a number of years at some point when his marriage, they did go apart. But it was also such a beautiful example of just the bodhisattva heart, the willingness to just drop everything and help out. And there was no such thing as a detour, like where the goal would have been to have dinner with us. No, that was what was happening at that point. That was what was most powerful, was to go help the stranded student.
Now, Trudy, my mind, I'm stuck on something from the earlier story. Where the heck did he go? And when he went out the window, was there a resolution to that? Did you figure out why he did that?
Yes, I was going to do that. I was coming to that. So the next thing is, I he escaped, and I told the story of his dropping everything to help that student side by side with his escape, because it was a way of showing why he might need to escape from time to time, especially from
to go help
a
people.
larger group of people who were all there to see him. But also, I could see how at some points, and this is not his phrase, it's mine, he might have felt a little vampirized too and needed to escape. But me being me, and I have no comment about it except to say that I decided to go find him. And I knew where he probably was because there was this path up the mountain. He had started building a home up El Salto, and halfway between the house site and that house where he was living, he had this tiny little lean-to where he would just go to be alone and have a cigarette. And so I climbed up that trail to where that was. And sure enough, he was there. He had built this little fire of pine cones and some twigs, and it was smoking, and he was smoking. And when he saw me, he just motioned to sit down next to him, and he gave me a cigarette. And yes, we both filterless cigarettes. I think they were Lucky Strikes. We were smoking there, sitting by the little smoldering fire. And he just said, all he said was, he took a deep drag of his cigarette. And as he exhaled, he said, inside and outside become one. Because there we were, wreathed in smoke from the smoldering twigs and leaves and pine cones, smoking our cigarettes. So smoke inside, smoke outside. That's clear mind. That's nothing extra. That's when inside and outside become one. And
That's beautiful.
I think another story that I would tell has to do with my brother and me and our relationship, because as I mentioned, I was the big sister, and my brother had a lot of obstacles and just very intense life. It was really hard life. Like, just things would happen. He would get a girlfriend, somebody lovely, and then she would be on her way to the halfway house to visit him and would get hit by a car and killed crossing the street in front of the house. Just things like that would happen to my brother.
Whoa.
Yeah, when Kōbun invited him to move to Taos, he drove out there in his Jeep, and somewhere in um oh, I don't know if it was in New Mexico or Texas. I think it was in Texas. A huge semi, didn't see him and edged him off the road, and his car flipped 5 times and threw him out. He got out, and then the car like exploded with all his stuff. This is just, do you know, anyway, that's my brother. But on the other hand, my brother, with all his troubles and the skill and ingenuity and courage he needed to live that life and somehow find his way, he was living a more ideal Zen life than I did. He lived simply in nature. He was very frugal. He had very little money. He had no possessions. He was totally at ease in the natural world. Ravens would tip their wings to him. Animals trusted him. But his big sister worried about him, right? And so during one of those visits, Kōbun, we went for a walk with Kōbun, and he was in the middle of us. He was holding each of our hands firmly. My left hand in his right hand, my brother's right hand in his left hand. So, the three of us holding hands. And as we walked, he turned to me and he said, and I'm waiting for the teaching. He said, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" And my brother, of course, was just this shy grin spread across his face. Like, for once, he was being more appreciated than his big sister with all her achievements and stuff she did and does. And I was quite taken aback for a moment.
I bet.
I'm like, wait a minute. I worked really hard to get where I am. That kind of mind, the reactivity just rose up in me. And then I realized this was Kōbun's way of recognizing my brother's gifts and reminding me of another teaching that he had given me years before, when I was a teacher at a school that I had co-founded with a couple colleagues, a school for severely emotionally dysregulated little kids who couldn't fit into any kind of daycare or kindergarten or regular mainstream programs. And I went to Kōbun and I said, how do I help these kids? And I was just looking for his wisdom. And he said to me, "No idea of helping." Another one of those mind-stopping moments, right? And I thought, oh, of course. I understood what he meant. No me over here helping you over there. No sense of separation, let alone superiority or sitting in the power seat, or all those things that being, even our altruism is always tinged with some kind of, I don't want to use the word ego, but I do things to be altruistic, but they also make me feel good. It's a mixed motivation. Anyway, he wasn't blaming or shaming. He was just saying, if you want to help, look at it this way. Have no idea of helping. just be as close and as intimate with them and with the situation as you can be. And so when he said that to me about my brother, I really felt like he was reminding me of my brother's gifts, yes, but also no idea of helping. You, the big sister over here, helping him, the younger brother over there. No idea of helping. Yes, those are some of my favorite stories from my practicing with Kōbun, which was really, it was a few years. I would go once a year and sit sesshin with him at what we call RMDC, Rocky Mountain Dharma Center, which is now, I think, just called the Shambhala Mountain Center. It was closer than California, so I went there. I went to Jikoji for a sesshin once and to Hokoji. And then, as I said, Kōbun went into this period of just a kind of retreat and maybe semi-retirement for a number of years. And during that time, I, who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, met, I think probably, in 1979, my next beloved teacher that we will talk about, Maureen Stewart Roshi, moved within 10-minute walk from the apartment where I was living. And I began to practice with her. But the years with Kōbun, I saw him later on, and I'm trying to remember if I sat with him later on, but I certainly spent time with him, and he came to my wedding with my husband, George Bowman, and I just felt that we stayed very close, even though we didn't see each other much until he died. When he did die was 2004, I believe. I remember I was teaching a retreat at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, IMS, when I got the news that, yes, he had drowned trying to rescue Maya, who was at the bottom of the swimming pool when he came out. And it's very mysterious because it was actually a very small pool. I had this intuition. I'm not the only one who thought this, I know now, but at the time I just had this really strong sense that Maya had drowned, and when he was already gone or leaving, or however that happens when the body dies, and that he made the decision to keep her company. Because the present moment for all of us is the most powerful. But for Kōbun, that present moment also contained the call to help. No idea of helping, no thought about himself, just merging with his daughter and going with her. That was what I felt. It's a big mystery, right?
Wow.
I'm really happy to hear that you went and practiced at Jikoji and that you had that experience, because then I realized, yes, Kōbun is still teaching in his own way.
Yeah, it was lovely. I guess there's a couple things that come to mind I'm curious to ask about. One is a little bit more technical. What was the difference? What was it like going from the sort of Korean san style that you were learning from Sunsunim and going into the Japanese tradition that Kōbun Chino was practicing in? Like, what I know, there's in some ways these are not that different, but in other ways, subtle differences can seem huge when you've been practicing something for a long time and then it changes. So I was just curious, how did you experience the sort of change in the form of the Zen you're practicing?
Yeah, the Korean tradition, we practiced with what was called a wato, which was a kind of koan, and that was how Sansanim taught us. And to ask, as we discussed in our talk about Sansanim, you get a question. In his case, he gave us the question, "What am I?" And that becomes really your meditation subject. Now, Kōbun had a totally different approach. he thought that posing a question and putting it in your consciousness, he said it was like it would just stick there like chewing gum, and he wasn't very admiring of that system.
Okay.
There's look, I mean, there's competition between Buddhists, right? Ministers, rabbis, priests. It's just part of human
Yeah.
nature. Anyway, so for him, it was really the body and the breath, the posture and the breath. I remember he helped me with my posture. I used to tip my head down and look down, and he just came around very gently behind me and lifted my chin with his hand, just gently lifted my chin to a posture of more dignity,
Mm.
more awake too. And so his teaching was it seemed the words were very gentle, and his manner was very gentle. And he seemed to embody almost feminine virtues that way. But the retreat schedule was tough. And in his own way, he had asked us big questions and encouraged that kind of inquiry
Mm.
into the various assumptions and concepts and all the ideas, opinions we carry around with us in our brains. And he used to say, and I remember asking him a question about the difference between the Korean in that very first session. There was a Q&A, and I asked a question about why don't you use, that's when he said the chewing gum, why don't you use these questions in your teaching? And then he said to me, but not in a kind tone, so what is your koan? I
Mm.
felt it was a dripping with something tone. It scared me, actually. I got really paranoid. He said, and have you solved it? And it was like, that's how I felt anyway. I don't know. It may have been totally my fantasy. Of course, everything is my consciousness. And he was just the mirror for it. But so that was the difference. He really just felt that your own breath, your own body, your own experience is the subject of your zazen. And he also said about the teaching stick that we used to use in the Korean tradition. We would take turns walking around with this stick. And if somebody bowed and requested it because they were falling asleep, you would tap them on the top of their shoulder to just wake them up, not to hurt them and not too hard. Although some of the men used to whack each other, but that wasn't the intention. They were just
They brought that independently to
Yes,
the thing.
they were young men into taking any opportunity to whack each other. So, okay. But Kōbun, about that practice, he said, my tongue is my kyosaku. My tongue is that stick. In other words, that he could say things that would point to the heart of whatever it was that whatever sort of affliction or poison needed to be drawn out of your psyche for you to
Mm.
look at and work with and let go. He could do that.
Mm.
And the Kyosaku is that stick, the name in Japanese Zen. So the walking meditation was different in that tradition. You take like a teeny half step, sometimes with your breath, but very slow. Yeah, maybe half of your foot forward, and then the next half of your foot forward, very
Mm.
slow. And there's lots of differences, but mostly mindfulness, for example, is not taught explicitly it wasn't back then in any of the Zen traditions, but it was taught through the choreography of, in the Korean tradition, eating with those four bowls and having to
Right.
use the specific. In the Japanese tradition, all the things I'm talking about, you enter the zendo with your left foot. There's lots of little mindfulness practices like the oryoki, and it's very ritualized how you do it and how you tie the bow that of the napkin that holds your bowls and everything so well choreographed that you can't do it if you're not being mindful. One of the joys for me, having had the opportunity to practice in some different traditions, Vince, is seeing the commonality, the deep, really profound commonality of the teachings of the Buddha, but expressed in wildly different ways according to the different cultures and traditions. And I don't know, for some reason, it just makes me feel a lot of joy that there can be that diversity of expression, of cultural expression, but that at the heart of it are these profound teachings of awakening that are steady and consistent.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I've hanging out with different Zen teachers over the years, I've gotten this impression that like the Zen learning environment is much more, yeah, like you said, things are implicit, they're built into the choreography of it versus explicit, like everyone's sort of telling you what to do and what to expect. Is no, it's just you jump it, you go into the environment and you learn through immersion and then figure some of these conceptual things out maybe in retrospect or whatever, versus get front loading all the conceptual information, which like
Right.
in the insight tradition, then you go in and you're trying to get things to conform in some ways to the
Exactly.
ideas.
Exactly. There's a map and you're trying to follow the
Yes.
map. And there's no map in Zen. Now, the upside is what you're expressing, that you can't conceive of it and then try to compare yourself to stations on the map and am I there and so forth. But the downside is that you can waste a lot of time sitting on your Zen, doing Zazen without any instruction, when some instruction and a little structure might be really helpful.
Yes, one of the failure modes. Yeah.
It's every path, every person. We have our strengths and weaknesses, our evolved and devolved aspects, facets of who we are, right?
Yeah, no
And the
doubt.
same for each tradition, I think, too. And through them all runs this thread of misogyny and patriarchy. And I just need to mention that because this is something that really women have been working hard, not just in the West, but all Buddhist women in many countries have been working hard to change this and work for more equality in in inclusion in leadership and power in organizations in all kinds of ways, and respect, ultimately just wanting equal respect, whether it's nuns and monks or lay women and lay men. And this is something very important, and I respected Kōbun and Sansanin, both of my early Asian teachers, for making women teachers very early
Mm,
on,
mm,
being kind of pioneers in doing that.
right. What you're sharing, Trudy, reminds me too of like a theme I hear in what you're sharing, the stories of, you talked about quote unquote feminine virtues and Kobun's kind of embodiment of those. And I was I've personally moved away from using the terms masculine and feminine in recent years
Right.
because of how much additional stuff there is that comes along with that. And you have to
Yes.
kind of tease it all. You spend 30 minutes making
Yes.
distinctions.
I was gonna say, we can do some gender studies right here, but go ahead.
Right. It's a little mini gender studies course every time you use that. So I ended up just really feeling more, the point that I was trying to get at or see is the difference between people whose conditioning is more like self-focused versus other focused. And that's, I hear that in a lot of what you're saying, like the first story you shared about how he pointed you back to your experience, like when all your teachers are gone, who will you learn from? Well, like
Yes.
yourself. And making the Dharma his own. I hear that sort of it's almost the pointing to the opposite. So I'm more self-focused. I suspect when you were younger, you were probably more other focused. I don't know. I'm just guessing. But it's like pointing to the opposite of where
Right.
people's conditioning is. It almost sounds like there was a bit of that going on in what you're describing, where he was pointing you back to where you needed to be, which was looking at your own experience and not going out into losing yourself in others' opinions and judgments about what you should be doing or whatever. Is that accurate? Does that seem?
Yeah, I think it really pointed to something super interesting, which again, I want to just offer about to the all gender movement of today. Where are we? 2020,
1999, Trudy, is where we are.
1983. No, 2023. And to say, bear with me, because 50 years ago, we were not really recognizing the range, the fluidity and range of gender that we do today. And that's a huge progress, I believe. But
Yeah.
back then, I saw it more like this, that classical Buddhist teaching is that the three actions or obstacles that poison our experience of life are greed, hatred, and ignorance. And we could say, we could frame that a lot of different ways, but essentially those three things, a kind of lack of awareness and ill will and craving, a lot of ways to frame them. And I used to think sometimes, actually, there should be different ones for women, because the three
Mm.
things that used to poison my experience were low self confidence, lack of self esteem, anxiety, and depression. And I felt like there are the things that, and I want to give a shout out to Sylvia Wetzel, German Dharma teacher, very strong feminist, who created a whole teaching around this, that a lot. But before I even met Sylvia, I always felt intuitively that as a woman, just what you're saying, I had always been conditioned to put other people's needs first. My sister and I had an abbreviation for it, OPN, like when you would just lose your balance, and OPN, we got caught in, we lost ourselves in somebody else or taking care of somebody else or trying to please somebody else. And I always would look at some of the men around me who didn't seem to have a problem putting themselves first. Or even in a small way, like my husband, he never felt like I did, that I had to return my phone calls and, I don't know, metaphorically eat all my spinach before I could have the dessert of doing more meditation. For him, it was like, no, I have a right to meditate first. Then I can take care of all the rest of that, which I think was actually a wiser perspective. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just some reflections that might be along those lines.
Yeah, yeah, no, it feels, yeah, it feels similar. And I guess for me, it's been helpful to decouple the gender, like biological gender from these proclivities because of the flexibility. Like we're recognizing, oh, people aren't fixed to their gender, to their biology, like who they are and how they express
Right.
themselves and their tendencies, their personality. So I know men that are other focused, like they tend to lose themselves and what they need, but it's more rare, the conditioning wise. And I know women who are self-focused.
Of course, any generalization isn't going to work for everybody at all, but it does have
Yeah.
some truth. They do have some truth to them, right?
Yes, I think so, very much. And I guess part of thinking about like skillfulness or skillful means, that's where I guess I hear you describing a kind of skillfulness from Kōbun. And I don't know if this was intentional or not, but where it seemed like he was responding to your needs. And I wonder, like, for someone who is more self-focused, let's say Steve Jobs, who I also understand was a student of Kōbun Chino's. For someone like that, I wonder how he would respond? Get your attention off of yourself, and like when everyone dies, who's going to be your teacher? Not you, not just you. Hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know if you saw him responding differently to different people in terms of their personalities, or did he have more? I guess this is where my a question is forming. Did he, like, was this, because some teachers are really good at helping certain kinds of people with certain things, and then they just, because they don't understand other people and how they are, they can't help them as much. Did he seem to have that skill to meet different people where they were, or was he
Yes,
maybe?
I think he had a very, one of the things that can come out of doing a lot of zazen or meditation is that you strengthen your intuition. He was very intuitive to the point of
Mhm.
being psychic. I felt it was discomfort. It made me uncomfortable at times because I remember once he called me up and said something about my new boyfriend. I had said nothing to him about that, nothing. And I was just like, oh, how do you know? But he knew. So he was very intuitive. And so, yes, he was able to meet people, so many different kinds of people
Hmm.
right where they were. I think my brother and me is a good example. But I know that he told you he had this model of the gorillas, people undercover. And I think that too, he would meet people who wanted to be front and center, right? Who wanted to have all the religious titles and lineages and transmissions and that. He would meet those people, and some of them he, I think, did give that to a few. But then he also, one of his students, Sonia Margules, didn't want any of that. And yet she was a very accomplished, longtime student of his, a senior student. And they were having a conversation about this. And then she left the room and she offered her bow. They bowed. And as she left the room, he called out her name, Sonia. And he threw his teaching stick at her. And she caught it. And then she was allowed to ordain students and be a teacher. And that was her. Anyway, I think
non-orthodox transmission.
Yes,
I like that.
Yeah, exactly.
What if she had dropped it?
Luckily, she caught it.
Exactly. That's sweet.
Yeah, I probably would have dropped it.
I think so too. I would have too. So I was thinking about, before we talked about some of the stories about Ram Dass and his teacher Maharaji, and one of the things that's so interesting about the story of Maharaji is the impact that the dude had without leaving his spot in India. Like he had this tremendous global influence through some of his students. And there's even that sense that he knew-ish, like he maybe knew he was having some of the impact he was having. Now I get there's something similar here with Kōbun Chino's story. I remember when I was reading Steve Jobs' autobiography, because I'm into tech and stuff. Of course, I'm interested in these things. And I wasn't that surprised to see that he was a Zen student. Like I knew he'd done LSD in the 60s with everybody else that was doing LSD, like everybody. But I was a little surprised to then see he was a student of Kōbun Chino's. And I remember, of course, you're talking about him. And as I got into it, I thought, oh, like he wasn't just someone who just came by once and checked it out. Like I think I saw Kōbun Chino married. He and his wife in the early 90s officiated their wedding. So Kōbun Chino had this impact through Steve Jobs, through his philosophy, through the practice he did that actually has impacted billions of people indirectly. We're doing this call right now. I'm on an iMac. I'm guessing you're probably on a Mac.
Yeah, I am.
So Kōbun Chino's influence, I see that through that particular student. You can see it's like a broad impact on the design thinking behind the objects we all hold in our hands and use constantly to connect. What do you think of that? Like, have you reflected on that?
Johnny Ives designed most of the things, and I don't think that he was sitting zazen. He's just a brilliant designer.
Johnny Ive had a huge hand in it, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of the design. But
sure.
Yeah, I think that Ram Dass was hugely instrumental in spreading Maharaji's teaching. I think more than any of the other students, it really was Ram Dass who brought it worldwide. And I was just laughing to myself because I thought, well, you're doing it right now with this series. You're spreading the teachings of teachers that are gone.
Right.
Through the words of some of their students. And there's so many ways to spread the Dharma. And it's really important to remember that everybody doesn't have to think they have to become a mindfulness teacher or whatever, that you can do it in so many creative ways. And like my book that I'm working on, Vince, it's not a Dharma book full of Dharma teachings. It's a memoir. And I thought, okay, I've always used my life in the service of teaching, like putting it up. And I do that as much as I can on social media, trying to use it in a good way. And
yeah.
And it's the same. I feel like I had some conversations with my current husband, who happens to be also a well-known teacher who has done a lot of work to spread the Dharma. And he was questioning this book at first, not anymore, but at first. And I said, that's not how I want to spread it through this creative writing that will be relatable, especially for women, but not just for women, but especially, I think, just because I'm a woman and I share some specifically female experiences. But I just think that we can each find our own way according to our various talents and longings. I devoted my life to psychology and Buddhist study and practice and some of the interface between those two. But I always wished I could have been an artist. There's
Mm,
always some little part of you that maybe you want to be a monk or maybe you want to, that. And so now with writing, it's art. So
yeah.
it fulfills. So I think each of us, we have some, maybe like me, you might wait till almost the end of your life to realize, to realize your dream of fulfilling that other part, but it's never too late. You might.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. That's cool. Yeah, I wanted to also share, I guess, something that came to mind when you were talking about Kōbun and his responsiveness, how he would just respond to what was needed. Like, person calls, they need gas, he leaves, he goes and does it, or climbs out the window or whatever. That seemed like he needed to take a smoke break. Um,
Yes,
fair.
exactly.
But I feel like when you're describing that, I very much have that experience of you too as a teacher. And I was thinking about how when Emily and I lived in Los Angeles in 2011, when we moved out there to study with you, I remember going to this public event that Inside LA held and that you were presiding over as the host with Stephen Batchelor. He came in and was
Oh,
teaching
yeah.
on
Yeah.
Buddhism without beliefs or whatever. And and you at one point we were in this, I think it was a church, maybe 100 people there, and someone asked a question and there wasn't like a mic runner, there wasn't someone with a mic nearby. And I had been a producer, it sounds true, I'd been producing media, and my first thought, I'm sitting here, is like, where the hell's the mic runner? You got to have someone and as I'm sitting here griping in my mind, you are standing up, going over, grabbing the mic, and then running it. You become the mic runner. And it was that moment where it's a very similar vibe of, oh, like this is part of what these training, the practice is about. It's about responding in the moment to what's needed and not necessarily just going into griping producer mind. And I really learned a lot. That moment really stuck with me. And it's a simple thing, but it's the kind of thing that maybe we lose this in the internet age. Like, it's the kind of thing you have to be around someone to see them and
Yes.
how they are and how they live.
Yes. Yeah.
I wonder if
I
we've
think
lost
it's
some of
I
that.
think it's a huge loss with the internet age, along with all the incredible things of the
Right.
internet. And I do worry about people having more and more synthetic relationships with AI going forward. And what is that? How do we learn these profound capacities of the human heart from a synthetic relationship with a machine that doesn't have the capacity to embody them or do anything more than parrot teachings? Anyway, they'll be able to do way more than parrot teachings, and yeah, that's a whole nother topic. But I am just
Yeah.
naming it because you mentioned the change of actually being somebody's physical presence and watching just how they move, how they talk, how they carry themselves through their life and respond to what life brings.
Yes. Yeah, that was the really beautiful part about living in LA for that year and being around, was being able to actually see that in real time. And
I'm proud of all the things you've done since you left, but I did wish you would stay.
of course, yeah, likewise. Yeah, likewise. But it was such a great time. I'm so grateful for that. And hearing you describe your practice experience, like, I'm struck by the difference, yeah, of maybe generationally how I have had a lot more virtually mediated relationships with teachers, less time just living with folks or living around folks who are teachers, not in a retreat environment, which of course is very orchestrated.
But I also want to say that the virtual experiences that we're having are real relationships
True.
where the social media is the medium that allows us to actually be in some relationship, or the what I don't know if we call this a podcast or whatever you call this.
Yeah.
Yes, allows us to be in a relationship. You're real and I'm real human, and we're relating to each other in
Yeah.
a way that actually we couldn't without the internet, at least not
Yes.
today. But when I'm talking about synthetic relationships, I'm talking about with chatbot. And
Right.
I just want to make that clear.
New kind of
It's
AI
not human
stuff
to human where the technology is
is
facilitating the relationship.
mediating it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I saw the aforementioned husband, Jack, is going to be in conversation soon with Sam Altman at the Wisdom 2.0 conference about this. I'm excited for that conversation. I'll be there.
Yes.
And I
Your
couldn't.
listener, Sam Altman, is the one who has developed the chatbot GPT.
Yes, he's the CEO of OpenAI, and really excited for that conversation. So tell Jack I'll be looking forward
I'll
to
tell
it,
him.
and to bring his heaviest hitting.
Yes, I will tell him.
Load him
For
up, Trudy, with your concerns so he can bring this on stage.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share about Kōbun Chino, anything else, other stories that come to mind or things that you didn't get a chance to say but that are important.
I just want to say that Kōbun was impressively who he was. And in being around him, he felt very empty. And I mean that in a good way. You didn't feel, he was just the best listener because of all that inner spaciousness that he had. And you didn't ever feel that he was carrying around a lot of ideas that he wanted you to have or to impart to you or something like that. It was I love water. I'm just a water spirit. I love water, and I all felt that Kōbun had that maybe water was his element, that he could really flow with situations and people in his own way. And I just have so much gratitude that I got to have even the small amount of time that I had with him compared to some people who lived in California, studied with him for many years, because Kōbun was the real deal and he wasn't like anybody else. he was just Kōbun, and a very beautiful man and a very flawed man with very deep struggles of his own, which was just part of his humanness and part of why he wasn't an example for us to emulate. And that was never his intention.
But there is something in that where he does become an example of someone who's not living that way. That is actually pretty interesting.
Yes. There's no way you can get away from being some sort of example for each other. Yeah.
But I know exactly what you mean.
I think you know what I mean. And he wasn't always nice either. Like I said, he said some things to me that were definitely impactful. And these days of everyone kind of focusing on the harms of conversations, that wouldn't be okay. But if you have a certain orientation to take it all as learning and teaching, then it can be very useful. And I'm not talking about being abusive or mean or anything like that. I just mean telling the truth.
Yes. Trauma sensitive mindfulness is a term that we use now, but I don't think that was in use.
No. But the thing is, I want to say that trauma is a really important thing to address and know how to address, because it can't be addressed by traditional talk therapy and the usual ways that we addressed things. And I see it as part of our evolution in Western psychology. Okay, when I was struggling with my husband, addictions were not part of sort of high level therapy. Recovering addicts were the ones who helped with addicts. And it was looked down upon field by the more educated, fancy credentialed type of therapists. And that has changed. Addiction studies is now respected, included part of the field. And it was the same with trauma initially. Nobody really paid attention to that. And people were blamed for their PTSD and all sorts of things that didn't. And now it's an established field. But often when we're redressing an imbalance, things go too far in the other direction. And I think we're witnessing that in our culture right now in different arenas, which are beyond the scope of this conversation.
Yeah, but still, thank you for highlighting that and situating us in our time and place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Trudy. This has been lovely.
Thank you, Vince.
Really appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, and thank you for this project.
Yeah, thanks. After nearly a year in private beta, the Buddhist Geeks Network is now open for any independent practitioners who want to engage in interdependent practice. You can find out more about the Buddhist Geeks Network by visiting buddhistgeeks.network. And if you'd like to join the community and join us in regular social meditation practice or other events that we host there in the network, all freely offered, you're very welcome to do so, again, by visiting BuddhistGeeks.network. Love to see you there.